from the Spanish Chamber of Commerce. Welcome. We're very pleased to have you on this webinar. Quick word of thank you to my colleagues from the other bilateral chambers. A special thanks to Pamina, who very kindly is hosting this webinar from her Zoom and is always one of the big team players to get us all working together. Also, thank you to Eve from the Swiss Chamber and Claudine from the Belgian Chamber, two very good colleagues that work so well with all of the other bilateral chambers. Always a great honor. And now to our guest of honor, Pieter Geldenhuys. Pieter, welcome. It's good to have you here this morning, have you as our guest speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Pieter and I go back many years to the UNISA business school days. Pieter is an incredible futurist and strategist. And when all this started happening, I thought who better than to invite Pieter to speak to all of you. You have read his CV in the invitation, and now you've also received a copy or a preview of his book that's going to be coming out in the near future. So what we're going to do going forward is that if you have any questions, please send them to me via the chat platform. We will collect it and then we will share with Pieter and he will answer. Unless you have a very burning question that you'd like to direct to Pieter personally, then put up your hand and we'll organize that. So without further ado, Pieter, welcome. Thank you. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Manola. I think afterwards I'll have to get your contact details so you can introduce me on other conferences as well. That was very kind of you. Thank you very much.
Before I actually hand over permanently to you, I'd like everyone to please mute their sound so that we can all hear Pieter well, and also keep your videos off. Only when we start with the question and answers, if someone wants to ask Pieter a question directly, then you can put your camera on. Thank you very much. Pieter, over to you.
Thank you so much, Manola. Are you hearing me well on that side? It seems everyone is. Thank you so much. And let's start this presentation. What a wonderful opportunity to share some ideas with you via the internet. And on my side, via cellular technology, seeing that I'm on a small little farm in Stellenbosch without the benefit of fiber, but a wonderful world that we're facing where the technology we've been using for years are now being applied in brand new ways. And I'd love to share with you some ideas and thoughts about the future after the big emergency. So what are we going to talk about today? Literally, we're going to talk about what is the role of a futurist in this space of unbelievable change. And what a futurist normally does is to take a look at all of the weak signals we see in the market, the news headlines, different information pieces and blogs, and try and make sense of the underlying patterns that guide us towards the future. Well, what an interesting time to be a futurist, because very few of us could literally predict the magnitude of the changes we are seeing right now in the market. Even the congregation of the world leaders at Davos, not a single word being mentioned of this unbelievable disease, even although it has been running amok in China for a good 4 or 5 weeks. So what we are seeing is a very difficult time that the world is entering into, and our ability to predict what the future might look like is quite difficult as well. I will, however, endeavor my best to look at some of the patterns that we've identified before the big emergency and try and contextualize that in terms of where we're heading. This is what Bill Gates said a few years ago. I think that this is more apt than ever before, that there will be more change in the next 15 years than there's been in the last 50. I believe most of us will say there'll be more change in the next year than in the previous 50. So I think it's time for an update of that quote as well. But this is literally what we need to talk about, this absolute juggernaut of change. William Gibson, author of the book Neuromancer, said, "The future already happened. It is just unequally distributed." And through that, he meant that sometimes what most academics in the field do is to look at the middle of the distribution curve. What is it that'll help us define what the future would look like? So the middle of the distribution curve is what everyone agrees upon, what the future would look like. But what William Gibson refers to are the weak signals, those things outside the normal distribution curve, enabling us to look at a variety of futures, the futures that could be. And based on these opportunities, how do we unlock the possibilities of the future? Or in essence, how do we create the future that should be? Now that is very difficult in an environment where we all feel that the COVID-19 disease or the SARS-CoV-2 virus took away a number of our choices. I beg to differ. I believe there will be unbelievable opportunities that will be unlocked because under an environment of stress, we see unbelievable innovation coming to the fore in order to unlock the opportunities to allow us as mankind to prosper and to move forward. So let's take a look at where we are. How will we unlock these opportunities in this space? And what will be the impact in the short term on our future? So what I will do is to categorize my talk into three main areas. Firstly, let's talk about the COVID-19 disease or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. I know everyone's talking about it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there's a number of key questions that haven't been answered yet. And let's take a look at how other societies are reacting to these changes. So let's get cracking. The SARS-CoV-2 virus, as humans, we've identified about 9 coronaviruses. This is but the last in line. We've analyzed the similar virus about 10 years ago that we found in bats, and that's why people realized that this virus is very similar to one we've seen before. This is how we are reacting to it. Now, I know that President Trump mentioned the utilizing ultraviolet lights, but this is literally what's happening in hospitals all around the world. These UVC robots that are being utilized in order to sanitize hospitals without using chemicals. And this is one of those key areas which I believe will have an impact on every single sector of society, not only on hospitals, but also on every other organization that wants to create a kind of a sanitized zone before you enter into a business. This is what's happening in China. For the last couple of years, they've been utilizing ultraviolet rays in order to kill or desanitize the public transport ecosystem. And we're going to see something like this soon. So in South Africa and in Europe, we're going to see public transport opening up towards these desanitation exercises. And we might even see this within our airlines, where this can be utilized to desanitize seats at the end of the day, but also these lights could be utilized within the air circulation systems within an aircraft that would then sanitize the air. And all of those emergency air masks that the airlines are so proud of showing in the first 5 minutes as you board an aircraft, it might be repurposed. Where as we climb on an aircraft in the next year or two, we might far rather like to put on those masks to breathe because it's being sanitized by these UV lights than the normal air of the persons around us. So a couple of interesting things on our horizon and how some of the technologies might allow us to mitigate our risk. We are going to see a number of these type of devices, even small UV robots that clean it up. And if we talk about the ultraviolet light spectrum, just realize that the ultraviolet spectrum is categorized into 3 types of ultraviolet. Ultraviolet A, ultraviolet B, and ultraviolet C. Just ensure that you use UVC, the ultraviolet C. The rest isn't really apt at killing viruses. And what ultraviolet light does is it disrupts the RNA or DNA of a cell and in essence kills it because it damages its RNA or DNA. Ultraviolet C light is also quite hazardous for humans. And that's why we are seeing robots utilizing this and not really humans utilizing the technology. So, so are you prepared to, have you already placed your order for your desanitation box? Because in months ahead, you will go out to the supermarket, bring your goods home, and be worried that some of the produce might be infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. By putting it in a sanitation box for a minute or so, you'll be able to sanitize the produce that you've purchased without using chemicals. So just a couple of interesting scenarios that will be unfolding in the short term. If we take a look at the longer term, we are seeing some significant changes in terms of our growth rates. This is statistics that I pulled about a month ago, and I think it might change as well. And that's what's so difficult with this virus, is that it makes it very difficult to predict the impact it will have on economies. But we're going to start digging into the medium and longer term impacts in a moment. Let's take a look at the short term implications of this. Here's a couple of industries and its exposure to the COVID-19 map. This was a North American study, but I believe it's just as applicable here in South Africa as it would be in Europe. So there's a variety of industries with huge exposure to the virus. We all know this by now: leisure, transport, tourism, and a variety of industries that make a tremendous amount of revenue from these services would be hugely affected. We are seeing a moderate exposure to a variety of other elements, mainly manufacturing, non-food retail, oil and gas, which is labor intensive and has a huge interaction with other individuals around us. And they would literally be exposed as well on a moderate exposure level. On a low exposure level, telecommunications, real estate, packaging, IT and software services, and so forth, that being some of the industries facing a lower exposure. The structuring of various economies around the world will literally have an impact on how the economy at large will be affected as well. And if you have any questions on this, put it in the chat platform next to me. I'll see if I can speak to any of them. But the structuring of various economies would be affected to a positive or a negative extent based on its exposure in these areas. So what are the scenarios that we're facing? A couple of scenarios. We, for example, have base scenarios of COVID-19, a base exposure. Then we hope there might be a fast recovery. A fast recovery that would allow us to react quite quickly to these changes. And after the first wave or two, it might have an impact on the medium term. The delayed cure would be a second or a tertiary infection wave, which might have a longer term impact on their environment. Finance and insurance is a question. One of the questions on the chat room came up, and it said that finance and insurance is of a concern. I will speak in a lot of detail around the world of finance and how that will be affected. So I will speak to that as well. But in terms of insurance, we see a huge change in the insurance industry. Let me explain. If we take a look at our traditional insurance models, our risk profiles is in most cases aligned to a model where we allocate a risk profile to an individual, how old he is, where he or she stays, and the history of risk. But in a hyper-connected world with the Internet of Things, with social media, with more and more data points we get on an individual, we might see fundamental changes in the insurance model. Let me give you an example. There's a company in Germany called Friendsurance. What they allow you to do is to get 20 of your friends, and not all of your friends, because we know that some of your friends might not be a good risk. You choose your friends that you know is a good risk profile. And those of you in South Africa, we have something called a stokvel. This is where individuals get together as a kind of a savings club. We're going to get something similar for an insurance club. So you get about 20 individuals and you pool your resources. Once you've pooled your resources, you could say, let's reinsure 30% of these pooled resources. If someone's car gets stolen or a house gets burgled or so forth, these are the high risk items. And this is what we can reinsure. But the smaller risk items, a laptop getting stolen or a laptop that breaks or a phone that breaks, we can then cover the lower risk areas out of the 70% of the funds that we have available. And then when the year is over, you can, if you haven't used any of these funds, you still have 60 or 70% of those funds available. And you can use that to subsidize the next year's insurance. So what we are saying is that utilizing social media, hyperconnectivity, the Internet of Things, machine learning, we can construct models that makes it far cheaper in order to provide insurance. And let's talk about that, because in the next couple of years, there will be an impact on what could be affordable or not. And you might have to make a decision. Am I going to cancel my insurance, or am I going to do insurance but do it cheaper and do it more focused? So I believe that the insurance industry is ripe for change. Let me explain why. We are right now in the winter of the fifth contractive wave. What that literally means is that in previous years, let's go back to 2006, what we've seen in that environment, if someone in 2006 told you that in 2 years' time, you will allow strangers to come and live in your house, and that you will drive around at night and pick up strangers in your car for extra revenue, you would think that they are crazy. However, what we are seeing is that one of the key elements in that ecosystem literally means that you change your method of behavior. So to drive innovation, you literally need three things. First thing, you need urgency. Secondly, scarcity. And thirdly, a change in behavior patterns or a change in perspective. A lot of technologies and innovations are not adopted in the market, mainly because there isn't a change in consumer patterns. But under an environment of stress, we see a far higher likelihood of opening up changing consumer patterns. And in 2008, in the global financial crisis, suddenly we saw Uber and Airbnb coming to the fore, and people doing things they never thought possible. I believe that in the next couple of months, we might even see changes in the insurance space as well. Not that the technology is new. The technology and the business model is literally 5 to 10 years old. But under an environment of stress, urgency, and scarcity, and a shifting of perspective, we will see changes in the insurance industry as well. And there will be huge implications on finance as well. I'll get to that soon. In the next year or year and a half, we don't know if immunity will be built up, if herd immunity will become prevalent. Even if we take a look at this unbelievable figure of 3 million people being affected worldwide, it's less than 0.5% of the world population. If we compare this to the Spanish flu 100 years ago, close to 20% of the population, or even more than 20% of the population got the flu. So it means that we've got a long way ahead of us. A key question, however, is how valid a vaccine would be. And all of us are waiting for the vaccine so that life can continue. But this is a respiratory disease. So it's like trying to kill a virus that comes and sits on the outside of your skin, because it sits on the outside of our bodies. It's part of our respiratory system. So this opens up huge questions regarding our future projections. Even if we get a vaccine, what can we do then? So let's quickly move over to the vaccine discussion. Let's see if I have it. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I have a small hiccup with my presentation deck. In terms of the vaccine models, is even if a vaccine is discovered tomorrow, what would that signify? It simply signifies that we might not be able to produce it in time. There are traditionally 3 ways of producing a vaccine, even once we've identified one that works. Firstly, we can use eggs, but this is an age-old example, and they used that in the Second World War. We started using bioreactors, using animal cells. For example, the kidney cells of Cocker Spaniels were used in the past to grow our vaccine products. And the liver cells of the green monkey is used in America to grow cancer, to grow vaccines. We can also use tobacco and absorb the vaccine within the leaves of tobacco plants, which gives us a very big yield within 4 weeks. But none of these plants can give us the volumes that we need. Here in South Africa, most of our vaccines come out of India, the developing world. India is the manufacturer of vaccines. And a number of countries are saying, shouldn't we put bioreactors or some of these tobacco plants in place so that if a virus is identified, we are able to manufacture them at speed? And these are some of the questions that is being asked. So we do not know, will we get a second or a third wave of infection? How long will immunity last? Will there be a mutation in the virus similar to the flu virus so that we get it every year? So in the past, we spoke about flu season. Are we going to talk about COVID-19 seasons in years ahead? These are difficult questions to answer because no one truly has an idea of what that scenario might look like. It does, however, mean that we need to be quite flexible in our approach in order to unlock the opportunities in this space. Let's move on to, I'm going to climb off the short-term implications of COVID-19, unless you want me to go into more detail. I would rather take a look at the medium-term implications and how our society, our economy, our environment around us will change in years ahead. So let's move over to our discussion about the medium-term future and what that future might look like as the impact of SARS-CoV-2 becomes more profound. So firstly, let's take a look at how demographics is going to play out. This is one of the reasons why we're being faced with more and more diseases as our population explodes. We are looking at about 8 billion people in the next few years. And even if we have a huge impact on individuals getting sick from the COVID-19 disease, 2 to 3% of the population, it wouldn't really have an impact on the growth of our population worldwide. But as William Gibson said, the future already happened, it's just unequally distributed. And this is what's happening in the world of population growth forecasts. In 3 countries, India, China, and Indonesia, we have close to 50% of the world population centered in 3 countries alone. But that's the past. The future will look quite different to that. So if we take a look at demographics in terms of the world demographic pyramid, this is what we see. A growth in the world population. And by all estimates is that we might reach about 12 billion people by the year 2100. But the growth in population is also unequally distributed. I'm quickly going to show you a few of these, and I'm going to get back to some of them later. But this is the US. We're seeing relatively stable growth in terms of population over the next couple of decades for the US. For countries like China, we are seeing a decline in their population from about 2030 onwards. Japan is already in a decline. And Japan is in what we call a population death spiral. It's actually becoming smaller. In Japan, they're selling more adult nappies than baby nappies because they've got a quite advanced healthcare system and people live longer. But literally, it means that more adult nappies are now being sold than baby nappies in Japan. And we see the same in Europe, a declining population in Europe. And there are various countries in Europe, literally, or most notably, Italy, as well as the countries and the business chambers that are logging in today. These are the profiles for Belgium. And you can see a trimming down of the population growth matrix in the younger population. So the population pyramid, for those of you that don't know it, male or female, and then the number of people in various age brackets as they make up a share of the overall population. The question we're asking is, what impact will COVID-19 have on world population? Now, there are some people that say maybe there's a short-term burst in births, maybe 9 months from now, as people stay at home and they connect with their loved ones. But in the medium term, we might see some severe financial constraints. And whenever someone feels insecure about the future, it has a direct impact on them making a decision to start a family or expand their families. So in the not too distant future, we might see an even larger shrinkage of the population base in a number of countries worldwide. That's Belgium, this is Spain. And there we can see again a population that's declining. We also see Switzerland with a population that's declining in line with what's happening in Spain and in Italy. This is the United Kingdom, more of a stable environment. I'm going to jump through a couple of countries, South Africa as well, definitely a higher growth rate, but not getting close to the growth rate we anticipate in Africa in years ahead. And this is where the growth is going to come from for the next couple of decades. Africa will grow unbelievably in terms of its population density. So if we compare the different continents, we'll see that Asia will start declining from about 2050, with India becoming the most populous country in the next couple of decades. And we're going to start seeing some severe decline in Europe, as well as in other parts of the world, with a decline at about 2065 in even South America as well. So this is what we are facing. And if we take a look at the population growth linked to each continent, this is what the world would look like by 2100. A declining Europe, a declining Asia, but an exploding Africa. And the impact and the question is, what will the world look like on our journey into that future? And I'm going to share with you a couple of these insights based on a population that is declining in terms of its growth rates, but also a population that is aging. Let's take a look at linking population growth and the various ages to when we spend the most. And research shows us that most of our expenditure is happening between the ages of 25 and 55. After 55, we start looking at our retirement and we start spending less. When we're at age 25, that's when we get married. Once we get married, we want to buy a car, we get kids, we pay for school fees, we expand our lives for a larger family. So literally, affluent 25-year-olds is what's driving the world economy. They buy phones, motor vehicles, consumer goods, electronics, and in a consumption-led economy, where the world music is defined by consumption, where people make things in lower cost ecosystems and sell that to markets that can afford it, this is the basis of our consumption-led economy, rich 25-year-olds. And that's the key problem. Most affluent countries in the world is running out of affluent 25-year-olds. Let's take a look at Italy, for example. What you see in the black line is the decline in the population aged 25 to 49, as Italy has an aging population. How is that decline in the population that will spend in years ahead aligned with the IMF's prediction of economic growth in Italy? As you can see on the screen in front of you, there's a disconnect between the IMF's growth forecasts and the population aged 25 to 49 in Italy itself. And that's some of the biggest concerns. What will replace the population, the affluent 25-year-olds, as they get married, buying homes in this ecosystem? The question is, will coronavirus help us balancing the age pyramid? That is I do believe it will have a more pronounced impact on people above the age of 65. And that's unfortunate to say, but I believe that we still should do everything in our what's humanly possible to protect the age population. COVID-19 is a horrible disease, and it's not a disease that I would wish upon anyone. But I do believe it will have a larger impact on populations with a larger aged population, or a skewed population that has individuals above the age of 65. So yes, it's a very serious question we've got to ask, but I do believe it will have an impact on some countries far larger than others based on their population pyramid. That being said, let's take a look at the European Union. And what you'll see in terms of the European Union is a decline in population as well. With this decline, we have to realize what happened. We build schools, universities, infrastructure, and literally if people aren't there, what do we do with that infrastructure? We have a population that's older, more skilled, and they can manufacture things. This means they'd like to export that to markets that can buy this. To whom will they export? Will it be China? Will it be the US? Will it be Africa or India? Here's the problem. A number of countries has got 25-year-olds, but they're not affluent. And therefore, they will not be able to purchase or afford the goods that is made by economies like the EU. Let's take a look at Russia. This is the Russian population pyramid, and they had some severe economic constraints towards the end of the year 2000. This had a huge impact on the population pyramid. In the next 10 years, the armed forces of Russia will halve. It'll literally be 50% of what we are seeing right now. And what impact will that have? This will have a huge impact on the geopolitical ecosystem. On the chat platform, is everyone still hearing me fine? I'm just going to look for some feedback. So if we take a look at Russia specifically, we are seeing a huge population pyramid shift and the impact this will have on the national psyche. And here's a very scary environment. Currently, Russia needs to protect something like 2,000 miles of border. They've got their soft underbelly, and that's where they're worried about Turkey. And they've got their exposure specifically across the European plains through Poland. Now, what Russia is worried about is that the territory they've got to protect with their armed forces is simply far too much for their armed forces in 10 years' time. And part of their long-term strategy, it might be good or not, is to limit their exposure. That means moving into some of the countries towards the east or influencing them through soft or hard power in order to ensure that their borders are limited. So if they can, for example, move towards the east, this will dramatically limit the exposure they have to a threat from elsewhere. Why they perceive this threat, I don't know, but we can that one of their moves would be to move towards the east to limit their borders to about 500 kilometers, and the armed forces will be able to support that. In the last 10 years, we've seen that Russia has started moving into Georgia, into Crimea, into the Ukraine, literally to try and protect their borders. And this is a key concern, specifically if the United States moves out of the NATO umbrella. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this is what's going to happen towards the east in terms of Russia. And they are mainly, the economy mainly based on, other than weapon sales to a few countries, mainly a primary-based economy. Our friends in China, they are even facing a more severe population death spiral, mainly because of their one-child policy. And we're seeing fundamental changes in the next couple of years. Yes, they will have affluent 25-year-olds, but not to the same extent that we identified in earlier years. So we're not going to sell a tremendous amount of goods to China to the extent that we planned previously. One of the economies that are looking good is the United States. I always joke when I bring in the finance, which we'll speak to in a couple of minutes, is that the US is the prettiest horse in the glue factory. They've got significant economic growth, high productivity, a very productive ecosystem inside their country, mainly due to their rivers and the ecosystem and their self-sufficiency in agriculture. But we're also seeing that the millennials and the people and the kids that are being born right now will drive a positive population growth. And this opens up a very, very lucrative market. And Americans know this. And when they enter into trade negotiations with Europe, they will be quite hard up in order to open up their borders and rather push Europe to open up plants in the US rather than buy directly from Europe as well. So even if the big car companies, Mercedes-Benz, Audi, and BMW will be forced to open up plants in the US rather than the US purchasing the cars made in Europe. So I believe that if the Trump administration will proceed into the future, their trade agreements with Europe might be as stringent or even more stringent than what they had with China. So that being said, this is what's happening in the world around us. The developed world running out of affluent 25-year-olds, and this will have a unique impact on finances, but also geopolitics, and I'll touch on that in the slides ahead. If we take a look literally at the areas in the world where population is increasing, those are the red areas, and that's where we get an uptick in terms of the growth rate of populations. And as you can see on the chart, it's the middle of Africa and the US. This is where we see an increase in population. And out of those two, the only one that's affluent enough in order to drive the consumption economy in years ahead would be the US. That's demographics. And what are the lessons we can learn from demographics? A pension crisis in Europe and a number of other countries, increased healthcare costs, a demographic death spiral in some countries, and a demographic explosion in others. If you have any questions at this point in time, I can speak to demographics, but I'm going to take the discussion further towards the world of geopolitics, and I'm going to explain how these lessons or these insights we get from demographics will have an impact on geopolitics as well. If there's any questions, please fire away. I can try and answer them in the interim. Alternatively, I'll move over towards the long-term geographical implications of that side. Yes, Manola.
Sorry to interrupt, but yes, we do have a question with regards to demographics. Do I pronounce the name correctly? Excel Rubens wants to know, will the coronavirus help balance the age pyramid going forward? And Excel, if you'd like to put on your microphone and also speak to Pieter, you're welcome.
But actually, the answer has already, the question has already been answered. Pieter picked it up as soon as I put it on the chat. Thank you, Pieter.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
100%.
And Pieter, just to take this a little bit forward with regards to this, so coronavirus will impact the population pyramid. Are we foreseeing anything else in the near future that can further impact the pyramid, population pyramid globally?
There are a number of unknowns. As we move into the rainforest in the Amazon, we are exposing ourselves to a variety of pathogens we haven't seen before. We see the same happening in Asia as well. So we don't know what other bugs is going to come our way. We know that there's an Ebola outbreak and a scare, and we've been quite successful in containing it. The coronavirus specifically was quite devious, mainly because it allows you to infect other people without you knowing that you are sick. It has an impact on us in ways that a traditional virus, it also doesn't kill us as quickly as the Ebola virus, which means that we infect more and more people. So there are a number of unknowns. What is critical is that in an environment of asynchronous warfare, and with the advance in technology, if there is a biological threat that is hitting the world, a man-made threat, what the coronavirus have shown us is that we're completely unprepared for it. We don't have the ability. Now, we might have the ability to roll out a vaccine very quickly for some of these biological threats. The problem is, how long will it take to get 8 billion people, reach them with a vaccine? We haven't got the manufacturing plants to manufacture these these vaccines en masse. So yes, Manola, there's huge threats. And I think that the coronavirus is opening our eyes to the deficiencies we have in our modern world.
Thank you, Pieter.
All right, let's take a look at the political realignment. Approximately 20 years ago, this book came out called The Fourth Turning. And to put it or summarize it, the book speaks about different types of generations and how different generations think differently about the world around us. In essence, it's the yin and yang. So where we create a system with instabilities within the system, but the system we create is an answer to a previous system that we didn't like. And over time, the inconsistencies in the system become stronger until such a point that the system collapses under its own inconsistencies, under which a new era is then opened. And we are seeing this already playing out in the US and in Europe, where the middle area, the middle ground in politics have given way to the radicals on the left and the right. And even in Italy, where the radicals on the left and the right form the government, we are seeing the old idea of left and right breaking down. It's no longer an analysis. A lot of people, so what is the difference between the left and the right? The left believes mainly, sometimes in isolationism, but in a government that is giving a bigger role for government to influence people's lives, where those on the right might like the government also to have an impact, unless you're libertarian, where you don't want the government to have an impact on your lives. What we are seeing is a fracturing of the existing political order, and that the old ideas between left and right is more changing towards the middle and the extreme, or populism and moderate. A realignment is taking place, and this realignment is seen all around the world, in Brazil, in Europe, even in places like Japan. What is, however, important is the role it plays in our geopolitical order. And this is where we need to talk about Bretton Woods. The Bretton Woods system was constructed in the mid-1940s, and the driver behind it was America, emergent US, which became stronger after the Second World War, and where the powers of the European nations started going into decline after the Second World War because of this huge war that they faced. We saw that America came to the fore and said, let's create a new world order, an order where the dollar will now become the dominant standard. Out of Bretton Woods, the World Bank, the United Nations, the IMF emerged. And this order allowed stability around the world against the threat of the Soviet Union. For America, the Bretton Woods system was always about security. They said, I will use my military power to provide the safety of the seas. I will use my military power to project power, and I'll use my military might so that you could utilize the power of the dollar, which we will peg to gold on a fractional reserve basis. And that would be the order through which we can prosper. And countries like Germany and South Korea, Japan, that were a few years before, prospered from the stability that the US provided from this global order of safety in their reaction against the Soviet Union. And this is where we had the Soviet bloc, we had the Bretton Woods countries, about 44 of them. We had the countries that aligned at that point in time with the Soviet Union. Amongst others, it was China and India and even Egypt at that point. And then the non-aligned countries, which didn't align with any of these two blocs. However, with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, the question was, what is the role of Bretton Woods? And what America is asking itself is, we don't have a security threat. We live on a continent where no one's really going to threaten our military might. And if you could look at the GDP exposure to imports and exports, you'll see that on the left-hand side, the United States of America only has about 11 to 13% exposure to the rest of the world in terms of their GDP. It means that if all imports and exports would stop tomorrow, purely on economic terms, it will only influence 10% of the economy. If you remove Canada and Mexico from that mix, the US exposure is about 5% of the world economy. It's a self-contained economy. They've got their river systems and agriculture and manufacturing and technology. However, there are some critical parts manufactured by other countries, notably microchips and certain products of steel. And this is one of the moves of the Trump administration. Early on, they said, let's try and change the ball game. Let's change the rules of the game to force companies that have taken their manufacturing base to China to come back to the American heartland or to Mexico, where the US can utilize Mexico as a low-cost producer. And because Mexico has a growing population, they will be the market for the American goods of financial products and technology. So it's like a marriage made in heaven. They don't want the Mexicans. That's why they got the wall, but they do love the Mexican products and purchasing power. And that's the model that Trump then pushed in. And they did it by lowering tax rates to allow companies to come back, and by increasing the tariff walls to make it more financially viable for companies to make the decision to relocate to the American heartland. And this is what we call decoupling. Decoupling from the world economy by forcing a number of plants to relocate to America as a long-term drive to remove America from the rest of the world. And that's what is referred to in the fourth turning. this prediction made 20 years ago that we're going to see a more populist approach, a more isolationist approach. And even if you take a look at the left or the right wing, if we use an old-fashioned view of the American politics, both the left wing and the right wing are both isolationist. They both believe that America should remove itself from the rest of the world. And America is asking itself this question: why should we pay a tremendous amount of money for our military, 200 military bases, 11 battle groups that cost a tremendous amount of money, if the benefit for America is so small that it's even 5% of their GDP? And this becomes one of the key driving forces in years ahead, a more of an isolationist move. And I believe that COVID-19 might even drive that isolation further, except for one or two areas. If we take a look at the European countries, a grid I brought in yesterday, you'll see that most of the countries have got some significant exposure to others through trade, imports and exports. And this means that it's hugely beneficial for European countries and others in the world to still conduct trade, as it's such a critical part of our economies. And that is going to be a critical question in years ahead. Who is going to protect the trade routes around the world if America pulls back? This is Belgium. And here you can see the importance of foreign trade for Belgium. It's huge, as it is for a variety of other European countries as well. What is going to be the key concern is energy security. We are seeing energy security changing significantly in subsequent years. This was the oil exports out of the Middle East ever since 2007. Now, the importance of the Middle East should not be underestimated. If we take a look at countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Venezuela, they all produce the heavy crude, the sour crude oil, where in the Middle East, the light sweet crude is manufactured. The light sweet crude is far cheaper to process into other fuels than the heavy crude we get from Venezuela and Nigeria and Angola and so forth. So there will still be a reliance on the various type of fuel that we get from the Middle East itself. So the question is, how did that change in subsequent years? And what we are seeing is that oil exports started to decline in 2015 to America itself, whereas Russia ramped up its production, and where the Middle East started to produce far more fuel for the East than for the US. And you can see in the latest picture that with an oil price point above $40, that America can produce its own oil. However, with COVID-19, everything changed. In Saudi Arabia and Iran, they at the well, I'm not talking about the economic system or political system, but in Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, at the well itself, they can produce oil at about $10 a barrel, where in the North Sea, it would cost you about 45 to 50, where in America with fracking, it's also about $40. And with the decline in oil price, this would have a huge impact on the growth rate. So looking at your questions, there's one that says, do you have a graph by the whole EU, as individual countries may not present the situation well? Jose, I do not have one on the slide deck. I can try and find one for you, but I believe that various countries in the EU might have different types of exposures as well per industry. For example, the Netherlands are hugely exposed in terms of agriculture, as they have got a huge exposure. Germany might have a huge exposure in terms of motor vehicles and manufactured goods and even high-tech technology. So it depends where you are in the EU, as well as the South, even places like Greece and so forth, heavily focused on financial services as well as tourism. So different EU countries will be affected differently based on imports and exports, based on the makeup of their economy, either be it financial services, manufactured goods, or primary goods. But I'll try and connect with you after the presentation to take that conversation further. Talking about Europe, we are seeing that Russia is trying to get into the European sector through a number of routes. They've got their new North Sea route, which coincidentally, the Americans is trying to hijack or to stop, mainly because they've got a bulk of gas they need to get rid of. And that's one of the ways they can do it, other than selling it to the Mexicans. The Americans believe they can sell some gas to the Europeans as well. And that's why they're trying to react against these routes that Russia is trying to open up. Russia, on the other end, is trying to bypass its pipelines through Ukraine so that they don't have to spend a lot of money on giving money to the pipeline managers and getting alternative routes into Europe for the European winter. So we can see a geopolitical map opening up. The problem is that if Europe becomes too reliant on Russia, it means that Russia can then start with some of their military exercises, and the European Union can't do much about it because of the huge reliance on Russian energy. So this is the geopolitical space that we're entering into in years ahead. Moving back to the Middle East, we don't know what long-term impact COVID-19 will have on the world's structure. Right now, we even have extremely cheap oil prices. We have to realize, however, that a huge amount of money and a huge amount of oil is required for agriculture, for tractors. And at some point in time, the bullwhip effect will come to the fore. And this will literally mean that in certain points in time, we'll have a shortage of oil. In others, we might have an overflow of oil. And this would literally have an impact on the price points in years ahead of fuel as well. Will the American fracking ecosystem survive COVID-19? It's too early to tell. You can't simply just shut down an oil well. It's to say, well, let's plug the oil well. There's a huge amount of pressure that pushes it up. So right now in the world, there's a scarcity in terms of oil storage because no one's using it. No one's driving around. And this is literally the reason behind that massive fluctuations in the oil price. But we do foresee the bullwhip effect having an impact on oversupply and shortage, and oversupply and shortage. And that's going to be one of the biggest impacts of COVID-19, is that this world order where the music was playing and everything was a solid flow of products throughout the integrated world will now go into an environment of shortage and scarcity, and shortage and scarcity over years ahead. We'll have a shortage of medical equipment, and then there will be an overabundance. There will be a shortage of medical masks, then there'll be an abundance. So there will be a shortage of ultraviolet lights, and in 2 years, there'll be an abundance. This is what we will start seeing in years ahead. So the wars of disorder, if we take a look at this picture, America still wants energy security, and for that reason, they'll still want their military bases in the Middle East. The question is, will they still protect the trade routes around the world with their military might in years ahead or not? And the question is, how will European nations then react to an uptake in piracy? If you received a pre-copy of my book, I wrote an entire article about a scenario in which small companies that focus on anti-piracy technology will become quite lucrative in years ahead as they try and protect ships against pirates in a world where America has removed itself from the primary trade routes. So those are some of the scenarios that you will see playing out in the book that you have an advanced copy on. Do you have any questions around geopolitics and how that plays out? I can literally stick here for years, but I don't want to go into the geopolitics of Turkey and Russia, the geopolitics of Japan and China and South Korea. It's a session on its own. I just want to make you aware of the fact that these are some of the long-term trends that will shape our world. Okay, so China, where do they play in this space? China is heavily reliant on trade. And what China then did is, they're not stupid. They realized that the Bretton Woods system is coming to an end, and they had to create their own type of Bretton Woods system, and they called it the Belt and Road. The belt on Earth, on terra firma, and the road in the middle of the sea. And by creating a Belt and Road ecosystem, they're doing two things. One, they're protecting their energy security, and two, they're opening up trade routes to Europe that they can manage themselves, and through opening up the trade routes, they could project the economic might. In terms of the trade route, in terms of oil, places like Djibouti, Sri Lanka, Mombasa, they've changed that into a military might as well, because China doesn't have currently the technology to project their power into the seas. Japan does. So Japan can project their power in the seas. China can't. This is one of the main reasons why China have taken over a number of territories, the islands in the South China Sea, Sri Lanka, Mombasa, Djibouti, where they can station their medium range missiles to give them that umbrella of protection if a kinetic war does break out at some point in time. Okay, that being said, this is where the world of geopolitics is taking us. We might look at a world of US decoupling, increased trade wars, weaponization of the dollar, where the dollar is being utilized as a political tool in order to assist the US in getting its objectives, be that with Iran, be that with Russia, be that with anyone else that steps out of line. And this is some of the scenarios that might play out in years ahead. Any questions on geopolitics before we move on to the next one, which is economics? All right. So what we are seeing is a phase shift in society, a phase shift in an order that will change our world, a realignment of political orders, the US removing itself from it. To what extent can we make some projections around where our economic order is taking us? Ever since the Second World War, our economies focused on job creation. The decimation brought by the wars meant that not a lot of people were really at the end of their wits. Governments were asked to create environments conducive to increased employment. And all across Europe and all across America, we started seeing an environment of growth based on employment. Because of employment, the inconsistencies in the system meant that the unions became too powerful. As the unions became too powerful, it started strikes then literally laid waste to a huge part of the economy. The strikes forced by unions pushed up the wage prices. Wage prices led to an increase in inflation, and this led to the hyperinflation of the 70s. And at that point in time, we knew that the system had to reset. And the system did reset. Instead of focusing on labor as the drivers of wealth, we started looking at capital. And this is where capital were allocated around the world to grow the economies of various instances. And we started getting the emergence of the supranational companies with manufacturing bases around the world. And capital became the key driver around this growth model. Unbelievable growth in the stock market. The inflation was tamed under Volcker in the US. In the 1990s, when the European Union imploded, it took away huge cost in terms of military expenditure for some countries. And we started seeing something interesting happening. Unfortunately, the productivity grew tremendously due to new innovations. Also, the internet, the fifth quantitative wave allowed economic growth. But what lagged behind was individual salaries. And this would come to bite us 30 or 40 years later, and I'm going to speak to that. And this is literally where we are right now. Huge growth that benefited parts of society, but big parts of society actually became poorer, specifically the middle class. So although in a number of countries, those that were truly poor, in China and a variety of other places, they became more affluent, the traditional middle class in Europe and in America became poorer. And that's very important to note. So let's see how that will play out in years ahead. This is The Economist. And The Economist stated that the world is now operating on rules that we've never seen before. A whole new world order emerging in terms of our monetary as well as our economic foundation. And we don't know what will happen next. I will make some projections based on what happened in the past, but I firmly believe that there's a number of waves: a technology wave, a geopolitical wave, a social wave, and an economic wave, which are crashing at the exact same time. And COVID-19 was the catalyst to make it happen. Those waves were always there, but COVID-19 is the pinprick that burst the balloon. And as the music is stopped playing, we are seeing that a huge economic crisis is emerging in terms of debt around the world. Let's talk about this debt and the impact this will have on us in years ahead. I just want to take a look at the time. I'm busy for an hour or so. I'm going to continue for about 10 minutes on the economic side, and then we'll move over to the technology side. But let's see how far we can go in terms of our discussion. So let's take a look at debt. These are the countries pre-COVID-19 that are at a debt of more than 60% of GDP. South Africa moved into the red territory as well. And if you take a look at most of the wealth, the OECD countries, they're all red, which means all of them have got a huge debt exposure. There are literally 4 types of debt we're seeing around the world right now: government debt, corporate debt, individual debt, and banking debt. And the challenge we are facing right now, ever since 1971, with the introduction of fiat currencies, is this unbelievable growth in debt. The business chambers that are with us today, look at your relevant debt ratios. Belgium at 104 debt to GDP. And with Corona, this might actually reach 110 to 115%. Italy at 131%. Switzerland, fortunately, only at about 32%. We also have Spain, and Spain is sitting at about 96% debt to GDP. So entire Europe, big parts of Europe, unbelievable exposure to debt. And how did we get here? This is what's happening in the United States right now. For those of you interested, there's a website called usdebtclock.org, and this debt have grown tremendously. I've looked at it. I took a snapshot earlier this year, and it was about 23 trillion in debt. I believe it's more than 25 trillion. I just want to impart on you the absurdity of these amounts. As humans, we find it very difficult to contextualize the difference between a billion and a trillion. If I were to ask you, how many days is a million seconds? So on the chat platform, let's see how good you are in terms of getting that one done. How long is a million seconds? How many days would you guess? Now, don't ask Google, try and do your own guesstimate. So on the chat platform, tell me, how much is a million seconds? Two days. So Pamina said 2 days. Anyone else? Teddy? So how many days would a million seconds be? 1 week? You guys are close. It's about 11 days. Right. So if we say, how much more is a billion than a million? We say, oh, it's 1,000. And how much more is a trillion than a billion? Oh, it's another 1,000. So 22 trillion, 22 billion. What's the difference? Can anyone try and guess how long a billion seconds are? Or is? How long is a billion seconds? Anyone? 33 years. And a trillion? A trillion would be 33,000 years. The American debt right now is $25 trillion. So imagine you have to pay back that at $1 per second. It'll take you 33,000 years times 25. It'll take you 600,000 years to pay back the American debt if we pay that back at $1 per second starting now. But that's nothing. The unfunded liability of America is the biggest concern. Currently, the unfunded liabilities is 146 billion. Now, that is the pension funds for soldiers and nurses and policemen and state government workers. So what is the pension that has been set aside to pay for the pensions of those going on retirement in America? That's the money that need to be there to pay for their pension. They need 146 trillion to pay for healthcare and pension for the state workers or the government workers. Money they don't have. So they've got $146 trillion liability that is open, that they need to pay out in the next 10 to 15 years. And the scary thing is, Europe is in exactly the same boat. So we are sitting in an environment with a huge amount of debt. And what is the impact of the debt? I'm going to come back to the slide in a couple of moments because I need to explain to you how we got here. What you see on the slide in front of you is the size of the financial economy. So that's the capitalization of goods against the GDP, the product that we do on a daily basis. In the 1980s, the GDP was twice the size of the value of the assets. Right now, it is 3 times higher than 15 years ago, which means an overinflated valuation of assets. And we started seeing pictures of this when our stock markets fell by 20% a few weeks ago, this overvaluation of assets we've seen in the past. So how can we possibly pay back this huge amount of money? We have 2 options. Option 1, we default. So all of the pension funds that invest in government bonds, we say, hey, well, we're not going to pay you back. We do Argentina on them. Well, that doesn't really work out that well for you because no one else wants to give you any money then in future. What's another way of paying back this debt? It's quite simple. You take out a 50 or a 70-year bond at 2% inflation per year, and over 50 or 60 years, you devalue the currency 2% per year without society noticing. And after 50 years, you devalue the debt to such an extent that you can pay it back. The British did that in the Second World War. I think 3 years ago, they paid the last of their World War II debt by taking debt and monetizing that debt over a 70-year period. And this is literally what most people have planned. The problem is, any debt we incur right now, we tax our future generations. And what do we mean with that? Governments spend more than what they get in. So they borrow the money by either one, selling their debt on the open market, and this was government bonds. But what started happening 10 years ago? What happened 10 years ago is that the Reserve Bank of each country started buying the government debt. So you create money for the economy by buying the debt of a government. In essence, taking away that revenue from individuals, from citizens, from companies to make money out of the government bonds, with the Reserve Bank buying the bonds of governments. And what's happening ever since the start of this year? The Reserve Bank is now buying corporate debt and even collateralized debt as well. Meaning that the Reserve Bank is buying the debt of the country, or in a way starting to own part of various private enterprises through debt, a kind of a reverse nationalization, but not the government owning it, the Reserve Bank owning it. This is really scary. Reserve banks printing money as an asset against, or so literally they say here is the debt, be it government debt or corporate debt, and then monetizing that debt by printing money in the process. And that is what we're seeing right now. The return to fiat currencies that is backed by nothing other than debt. And why is this problematic? Take a look at the impact it had on prices. So what I'm going to do briefly is to go back 2 slides. Oh, I do apologize. Looks like I made a bit of an error. Let's go back to this slide and show you what I'm talking about. Because of quantitative easing and the buying of debt, governments try to stimulate the economy by keeping the interest rate really low. So if the interest rate is low, money is cheap, and people would then use the money to drive economic growth. But it didn't happen. Instead of using the money to drive economic growth, what did most companies do? On the screen in front of you, you'll see what they've done. They've taken the cheap money and they bought back their own shares. Now, what does that mean? Let's say you're a CEO of a company and you get appointed on earnings per share, because that's the final measurement, how effective you are in managing your company, if your earnings per share goes up. But if you have cheap money, let's say you make a profit of 100 billion a year and you've got 1 million shares on the market. What is your profit? It's simple. It's 1,000 Rand per share. But if you buy back half of your shares, now you only have 500,000 shares in the market, but you still only make 100 billion a year. What is the profit you make? It's double, because you bought back the shares. So the earnings per share is doubled, but did you create any new value? No, you didn't. Now the slide in front of you will show that. It says GDP growth is flat. However, look at the stock market growth. Now this means an overinflation of assets. Remember that world order we spoke about after the 70s? Where now this is the monetization where capital drove the world order. And we started seeing GDP growth, which is flat. So economic growth is flat, yet our asset prices go through the roof. And the impact it has on different generations is enormous. This means that home prices shoot out of all perspective. It means everything becomes more expensive. Look at millennials. In previous generations, in the past, if you were age 35, you made up about 35% of the home owner base. Generation X's, when they reached 35, 20% of all homes were owned by Generation X's. Look at the millennials, 4%. Millennials reaching the age of 35 can no longer afford homes, mainly because our economic system of printing overinflated our assets. It inflated our real estate, it inflated our stock exchange, it inflated our currency. We are now at a cusp of unbelievable change in economics, geopolitics, society, and politics. And the youth want an answer. Now, this is normally the scary part where I show people what's happening. And I'm briefly going to show you what will play out in years ahead. Governments and reserve banks are printing money to try and stimulate the economy. The scare is that people don't use the money to drive the economy, but rather save the money because of uncertainty they face for the future. This would lead to deflation. If governments keep on printing money and people storing the money, and at some point in time they then decide, I'm a bit worried because I see that I have money right now and I'd rather buy assets rather than taking money, and they start spending it at the same time, this leads to hyperinflation. So the next couple of years will be this delicate dance on the reserve banks of trying to put enough liquidity in the market so that the system doesn't freeze, but ensuring that economic activity takes place without people taking the free money they get from government and saving it. But if they do, and there's a hoarding of money, then we might see this hyperinflation. One of the ways in which governments is doing that is negative interest rates, and also ensuring that people don't use cash and store it at home, which is the reason why people are moving towards digital currencies and why the big nomination notes, for example, the 500 euro note, have been taken away out of circulation. So these are some of the trends that we will start seeing in years ahead. How that will play out, I don't know, but we are seeing that even although there's this huge amount of money in the world, the velocity of money, the amount of money we share amongst ourselves have declined. And that's going to be one of the key considerations of reserve banks trying to get the velocity of money going up. So these are the scenario points. Pension crisis, the bursting of the everything bubble, fiat currency crisis, increase in populist policies, mainly because of the failure of our economic system. And that's the scary part. The beauty is that technology always comes to the rescue. So although these are the waves, the Kondratief waves I've spoken about earlier, and what we've seen in the past is that in times of recession and depression, a new wave of technological growth normally arises. And we foresee this by about 2028, when new technologies will unlock a new growth spurt based on DNA, biotech, nanotech, where we will unlock a far more productive world to support a growing world population. But it will be difficult to navigate due to trade wars, due to aging demographics, due to monetary systems that are under severe attack. And that's part and parcel of our discussion. So that's the sixth wave. What are some of the technologies that'll take us there? In the south of France, ITER is one of them, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. A new way of generating energy, because in a world of abundant energy, we can let agriculture flourish. In a world of abundant energy, we can make water potable. So energy will be one of the key challenges that will benefit from it. In this world, IT will benefit. And you're completely correct, Jose. If we, for example, take a look at virtual reality lenses, a little bit later, I'll show you that we can use virtual reality in a VR meeting room. So if you had your VR helmets on, I would be able to meet you in these VR rooms and speak to each one of you. And as I turn my head, you will pick it up. A far better way to communicate than staring at a screen and hoping that you can get the intention of my interactions on my voice and my body language. Putting one of these VR helmets on as an avatar, you will be able to interact with people. We'll be able to have board meetings and react. We'll definitely see changes. You're completely correct in some of the text coming up. Teleworking, remote medicine. In China, they don't use credit cards anymore. They don't use cash anymore. They only use their phones by scanning a QR code. So non-cash transactions, cashless transactions, telemedicine, IT, you are spot on. These are the areas that will be unlocked. As far as energy is concerned, unbelievable growth in energy. And this will open up huge new sectors of the society and economy we've never seen before. Mainly in Africa, as energy will allow us to go into agricultural spaces we haven't seen before. The Higgs boson vector, this is one of the key developments in the scientific field. On 4th of July 2012, the Higgs boson vector was identified, and this would open up unbelievable opportunities in the nanotech space. For example, we might get cars where part of the charge of the car is in the body panels of the car, not having a big battery pack at the bottom. So these are some of those scenarios. In terms of DNA analysis, we will analyze our gut biome, and by choosing the right mix based on our own DNA analysis and our own gut biome, we will choose foods that will enable us to live far more productive lives. My own genome, I've got the ApoE4 variant, which means I've got a very high chance of getting Alzheimer's, which means I have to radically change my diet. For those of you that have done your DNA test, you might find that some of these markers show it. The BRCA2 allele or the LADQ that shows celiac disease. These are all key elements that you can limit. And the important thing we have to realize is that once we know our DNA is there, that's not the end all or be all. We can literally change the way in which our genes expresses itself by optimizing our gut biome and by reducing insulin resistance. So looking at our gut biome, our microbiome is made up of 3.3 million genes, where our own DNA is only 23,000, which means that our microbia plays a far larger role in our health. So feeding the correct microbiomes will have a huge impact on healthcare. Right now, we've got a sick care system, not a healthcare system, where we only look at people once they get sick. In a healthcare system, we try and keep people living longer, healthier lives by not getting sick. And I can take you through a variety of scenarios. In the book that I've given you, I'm speaking about the benefit of DNA and microbiome research. I've written 2 articles on that, the various types of foods that you can purchase that will benefit you. But from a technology perspective, unbelievable growth is happening. So let's highlight a few. The Internet of Things will unlock new opportunities. We will get scanners in our phones that we will be able to analyze our food in the hidden microbial world around us, allowing us to make better decisions of our health. And we will be able to change our world in unexpected ways, protecting us from a variety of threats, be it drones or internet viruses or payment systems or smart homes. I'm giving you a couple of ideas and the book as well, but we've got 10 minutes left. Let's open the floor up for questions, and I'd love to answer some of them to the extent that I can. So I'm killing my presentation at this point in time, and I am reverting back to the videos, and I'd love to find out what you can, any questions you have that I can possibly answer.
Okay, Pieter, thank you very much for this. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask Pieter a direct question, just put up your hand, please, and then we can start unmuting the microphones and we can start interacting with Pieter. Any questions? Or would you like Pieter to continue with the presentation?
If there's any areas you'd like me to focus on and highlight, I can do so as well. I didn't speak a lot about the technology that will arrive in front of us, but if I may say, in the next 5-6 years, we are seeing established technologies, mature technologies, which is being utilized in novel and new ways. They will be the disruptions in the technologies and opportunities. So starting a business to get a portal for every house, so that if you buy your groceries, you put it in a decontamination box, and that the food that you therefore buy is decontaminated as you venture out into this COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infected world. Huge opportunity. Opportunity in teleconferencing, remote access, remote work, new models that'll save people money, like in insurance. So number of existing technologies, but applied in new use cases, that will drive very, very big economic opportunities in the next couple of years, as we're in the winter of the 5th quantitative wave. And then in about 2026, 27, we see a new era of economic growth based on the 6th wave. So what are the opportunities for the business chamber? In the next couple of years, some of the business models that might work and have worked quite well in Europe, be it cashless societies, cashless payment systems, new insurance models, 3D printing, because we will have disrupted supply chains. All of that technologies of micro manufacturing, not having to wait for China to provide us with things in an uncertain world where we can manufacture on home soil. So the middle stunt in Germany would be well played. New ways of growing agriculture and getting better yields. People are going to become price conscious in the next couple of years. And this will have a huge impact on which type of businesses can we unlock in the interim that will help us. So technologies that are contactless, remote, all of these have opportunities as we fear the next 2 years, and then a slow return to normal. I have to also warn you about the bullwhip effect. So oversupply, undersupply, oversupply, undersupply, that might have an impact as well. If your countries manufacture UVC lights or UVC robots, boy, you can start exporting them to South Africa, but I believe the rest of the world wants them as well. So huge, huge opportunities. Any questions?
Pieter, yes, there's a couple of questions that, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Manola. So
Wonderful,
where do you put your finance and insurance on your chart of exposure? Insurance, I believe there will be exposure. Mainly because people are looking at their revenue, and a number of people will be without jobs. That means they cancel things that are not critical. They'll cancel insurance. So a number of insurance companies will feel the brunt. financial companies, huge uncertainty around the liquidity in the market. So that's why the Fed opened up the international dollar reserve. Now, important to realize, the world, America exported dollars and they imported everything else the world gave them. With the shortage of dollars and the number of companies that have huge dollar-denominated debt, led to a shortage of the euro dollar, and that's why the dollar appreciated in value as people had to get the dollars to pay it back. This led to a shortage of cash in the system, which means that banks are a bit scared of letting go of their liquidity, which means that they're not as open to providing loans to people. So I believe a shrinkage in the liquidity of banks will have an impact on loans, on car loans. So I see huge concerns where people get rid of anything that they don't want. Their third car, second car, they'll get rid of. Because in times of uncertainty, people want liquidity. And that will have a huge impact on the financial system in years ahead.
Okay, Pieter, if I can ask you to now stop sharing your screen and bring up your video, and two very important questions from our audience. First and foremost is, if we can focus a little bit more on South Africa, and what are you seeing the potential opportunities for new markets, and what is going to be the impact on employment here in South Africa?
Manolo, can you see my video?
I can see your video. If you'd like to just stop sharing your presentation, that will be good.
I'm stopping the share, and you can take over the video. Manolo, your question on growth in South Africa. We are in a precarious space in South Africa, mainly because our exports, although I believe gold exports might increase in years ahead, mainly because of uncertainty, and the increase in uncertainty would lead to a higher increase in gold. So in terms of gold manufacturing, although our gold grades are not as high as we've seen in the past in gold mines, with the increased price point of $1,800, I believe that opportunity can be unlocked. In the short term, uranium, for example, I see a shortage internationally, mainly due to shipments, but this will be a bullwhip effect. As far as cars are concerned, this depends what type of cars and who we export it to. So, for example, our trucks, our bakkies, or our commercial vehicles, we sell that into Africa. Africa's got huge economic growth. They've got agriculture, and I believe that market will continue. However, I do see a decline in a variety of other markets, mainly because of the short-term challenges around the concern around the economic slowdown. So the economic slowdown will hit our manufacturing exports. The fact that we've been downgraded means that local manufacturing will become more competitive. So we've seen a number of imports in the steel environment into South Africa from China, but with the decrease in the purchasing power of our currency, some of these small businesses will have opportunity to be unlocked again if the virus doesn't influence the workforce. So our financial services are quite strong in South Africa, and I do believe they'll continue to provide support into the rest of Africa as well. But understand that the entire world will face a financial stress, mainly because of the fact that the Americans are printing money. Every reserve bank is printing money. And in times of uncertainty, people don't want to give the money out, which then leads to a velocity of money crisis, which then leads to deflation, leads to bank runs, leads to hyperinflation. So the next couple of years is going to be a critical point for reserve banks to manage the flow of currency and ensuring that the money they make available in the market is applied to keep the economy going, rather than people withdrawing that money and putting it under their mattresses.
Okay, Pieter, thank you very much. Any last question from anybody? Because I know a lot of you are going to be going into other meetings right now. And I want to thank our participants for sending really great questions. Pieter, if we can end maybe with a couple of potential quick ones that we can look at once lockdown is over for South Africa, and how the different bilateral chambers and the Swiss chamber can benefit from it in the near future, please?
We can look at some severe interruptions in certain supply chains that we can quickly react to, as this bullwhip effect will open up opportunities. Primary metals in gold, uranium, that'll be there. South Africa is challenged based on the fact that we've got a lot of debt. And our debt ratio and our and the fact that our access to certain reserves will be impacted in years ahead. I believe, however, that the financial skill, the agricultural skill, the manufacturing skill will give us the opportunity to support a growing African continent. We have got a very, very well integrated infrastructure. I believe there are certain positive benefits for both Europe exporting higher quality goods to us. We spoke about UV robots and UV lights, and that will be in huge supply. I mean, ask anyone in the audience if they would like a decontamination chamber for their groceries, and I bet you all of them would like one.
Absolutely.
So the opportunity is there for entrepreneurs to unlock it, and if those type of companies are there, they will face a market in South Africa for it. So yes, I believe there's huge opportunities wherever we look.
Wonderful. Peter, thank you very much for your time this morning. On behalf of the Spanish Chamber, the Italian, the Belgian, and the Swiss Chamber, we're really very pleased to have you around. We will be sharing your presentation and the recording of this with all the participants. And maybe in the near future, you can come talk to us once we've got to level 2 or level 1 lockdown, Peter.
It will be my honor and privilege. And I'm still new in this video conference game in trying to entice an audience while still struggling with my internet connection. My humble apologies. I believe that I will improve in time as innovation will allow us to unlock new ways of doing things.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully we can do one on virtual reality in the not too distant future, Manola. So I think the next time we all put a VR helmet on and we have our next meeting in a VR space. That would even be better.
Sounds good to me, Peter.
Thank you so much
ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. And stay safe and healthy. And we look forward to interacting with you soon in the near future. Have a good day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye.